The role that licensed games fill in the greater video game market has changed significantly over the past 2 decades. Early examples of licensed games made for the Atari 2600 and Nintendo Entertainment System were often produced as part of a larger merchandising effort. In addition to the obvious incentive of having more stuff to sell, this type of tie-in media is also important for raising the visibility of a brand and bolstering its place within the pop culture landscape. After all, a little boy walking through the local computer store might not end up buying that copy of Howard the Duck for Commodore 64, but it might just be the reminder he needs to ask his parents if they can go see the movie itself later in the week. Under this paradigm, it was rare for a development team to get the time and resources that they needed to provide a high-quality video game experience. As technology progressed and the industry saw the rise of both mobile gaming and games as a service, more and more properties would forego traditional console releases in favor of free-to-play games that demand a little less manpower and resources to put out. While there are still plenty of licensed console games being made, such as the myriad of anime-based arena fighters and a whole litany of Star Wars games, they're frequently derided for quality issues and questionable monetization schemes. But there was a time in between when it felt like the conditions were ripe for licensed games to succeed, after the awkward slump of early 3D, but before the prevalence of online storefronts and service models. A period when budgets were reined in enough to allow for experimental games, instead of the attempts at direct adaptation that came before. A time when developers were able to play around with the brand's established characters and themes in order to create something that was truly special. For me, the game most emblematic of this era is Yu-Gi-Oh! Duelists of the Roses. Based on the hit anime and manga series Yu-Gi-Oh!, Duelists of the Roses drops the light sci-fi trappings of its source material in favor of telling a historical drama based loosely on the War of the Roses. And instead of simply adapting the rules of the popular card game, it reimagined them into a tile-based strategy RPG. Perhaps more surprising than the premise of the game itself is its commercial success. Believe it or not, Duelists of the Roses sold over 1 million copies and currently ranks as the 138th best-selling title in the PlayStation 2 library. It just goes to show how much sway things like brand loyalty and name recognition can have in determining a game's popularity. After all, I really doubt you'd be able to sell a card-based strategy game about a 15th century civil war in England to the average person unless there's a real big name behind it. But this game's widespread success and popularity is part of the reason I decided to revisit it all these years later. It's no secret I'm a big fan of weird games, but a lot of the games I find myself drawn to don't usually find much of an audience. Something as unconventional as Duelists of the Roses seems like it should have gone down in history as a cult classic, but that just isn't the case. A shocking number of my friends, both on and offline, have distinct memories of playing this game as a kid. What struck me as more bizarre than the game's ubiquity, however, was its polarized reputation amongst the people I talked to. No matter how many friends I asked about this game, it seems like everyone remembers it a little bit differently. I always thought of Duelists of the Roses as an okay game that I happen to have fond memories of. It was an interesting take on a real-life card game that I enjoyed at the time. The game also captured my attention because of its basis in medieval history, something I've always had a fondness of. But a lot of the folks I've talked to don't share my same affection. Some friends of mine think this game is an absolute train wreck, with few redeemable qualities outside of a few unique ideas. Others have told me that this game is one of their favorites. Another set of friends fall in between the two, thinking it was a solid yet unremarkable strategy game based on a popular series. So, what's the deal? Obviously, no two people are ever going to have the same feelings on a piece of media, but from my experience, it's strange for a game like this to have such a wide breadth of reactions. So, I decided to replay it for myself and see how I feel about it as a grown-ass adult, and, if possible, try to pin down why my peers have had such a diverse set of opinions about it. Beyond that, it's becoming more and more apparent to me that card-based video games are going through somewhat of a renaissance in the industry. So much so that I thought it'd be a good idea to pile on yet another review series onto my channel. I played my fair share of card games as a kid, both physical and digital, but as I grew older, my friends and I lost interest. There were a few times in my late teen years and early 20s where I considered hopping back in on the card game train with stuff like Magic the Gathering, but I could never really muster up the motivation nor the budget to really give it an honest go. Admittedly, I still don't have much of an interest in getting into physical card games again. I've got too many other hobbies draining my wallet and time right now. But I'm more than ready to dip back into the world of video games that use card game mechanics as their core systems. There's a lot being done in this space that looks fun and imaginative, and I just can't ignore it much longer. So, let's sit on down and take a gander at the hand we've been dealt. My name is Rosenbrand, and this is Shuffle Time. In Duelists of the Roses, players take the role of a modern-day card game enthusiast forcefully summoned to 15th century England by a Smurf druid. The player is given a basic rundown of the War of the Roses and learns that they're actually the legendary Duelist of the Roses, who is destined to settle the conflict. The druid, named Simon, explains that duels in the past work differently than our own time and offers to walk us through a comprehensive tutorial. If you're playing through Duelists of the Roses for the first time, I highly recommend you go through with it. It might feel a little long-winded, but it covers a variety of edge case rule decisions and hyper-specific circumstances I'm happy I knew about before I ran into them later on in the game. I'm not going to give a complete rundown of the game's rules, in part because we'd be here forever, but I'll give you the basics. And, by the way, just because I don't want us to be here forever, I'm going to assume you have at least a basic understanding of how the original game played, at least a little bit. Every Duelist of the Roses match is a one-on-one battle between two players. Decks are made up of 41 cards, 40 of which are playable. The 41st card is a monster card that's assigned as the deck leader. At the start of a duel, players start with only their deck leader on the field. Deck leaders can move around the field and summon cards from the player's hand to an adjacent space, provided the tile is unobstructed. The goal of the game is to reduce the enemy's life point value to 0, similar to the rules of the original game. This can be accomplished through a variety of methods, including a direct attack on the enemy's deck leader, defeating an enemy's monster card in battle, or by using spell cards to deal damage directly. Players have a limit on how many cards can be active on the field at once, and more powerful monsters can't be summoned until players build up a resource called summoning points, which are received at the start of every turn. Each match takes place on a square grid broken down into tiles, which all feature a different terrain type. While most terrain tiles simply buff or debuff a card's statistics based on its type, other tiles carry special properties. Notably, Labyrinth tiles are impassable for the majority of cards in the game, and Crush tiles automatically destroy any card with a 1500 attack point rating or higher. The grid-based movement is the primary difference between Duelists of the Roses and the official card game, but there are several others that are sure to raise the eyebrows of longtime players. Perhaps most infamously is the ability to fuse together monster cards without the use of a spell card. While this can result in some powerful cards being put out into the field with little effort, in practice it's a bit more complicated. There's no indicator in the game itself regarding fusion compatibility, and if the fusion attempt fails, one of your two cards is automatically discarded. Even then, when you do find a combination that works, there's no easy way to tell what the fusion result will be. You just have to find combinations that you know work and memorize them. This is a strict trial and error process unless you resort to doing some online research, which I'll own up to doing after I got too many failed fusion attempts and I just got frustrated with it. Having one of your cards destroyed because you happened to guess wrong when attempting to fuse two cards was not a particularly enjoyable experience. It's a heavy price to pay for experimentation, especially when the fusion mechanic feels so integral to success. This game is incredibly frugal when it comes to giving you powerful monster cards, so making them yourself through the fusion process is the next best solution. The fact that you have to go through an elongated process of blind guesswork just to make that happen is not fun. That's not the only rule change you'll have to get used to, however. Another interesting addition is the attribute weakness system. In the original card game, every monster card is divided into different attribute groups, such as fire, earth, dark, light, etc. While these attributes occasionally come up in the game's mechanics, they're not particularly important in the grand scheme of things. In Duelists of the Roses, these attributes act more like traditional video game elements, each having their own strengths and weaknesses. If a monster engages another monster in combat and one of the cards has an attribute that's weak to the other, it'll be punished with a single turn of complete paralysis, assuming they survive the combat encounter. This new mechanic is called Spellbinding, and a lot of spell and monster cards have had their effects changed to include it in some capacity. There's a lot more changes I could get into, but for now this covers the most significant differences. It's a weird and imperfect system that feels like it needed a couple dozen more rounds of playtesting before it was finalized. I was curious how the hell they even came up with something like this, but after doing a little bit of digging, it started to make more sense. Although Duelists of the Roses might seem like a standalone oddity at first glance, a little bit of context goes a long way. For one thing, it should be noted that Duelists of the Roses is technically a sequel to a PlayStation 1 game titled Yu-Gi-Oh! Forbidden Memories. In Japan, their titles reflect this. They're known as Yu-Gi-Oh! True Duel Monsters Sealed Memories and Yu-Gi-Oh! True Duel Monsters 2 Succeeded Memories, respectively. You see, the trading card game that we're familiar with today came out after the manga and anime series had already found popularity. The card game's designers had the difficult task of taking a fictional game and turning it into a real one that had rules that actually made sense. The gameplay of Forbidden Memories was based off one of the prototype rule sets that were developed during this period. Duelists of the Roses then took this already bizarre gameplay system and expanded it into a full-blown strategy RPG. So yeah, the game's very foundation is based on a prototype that got left behind for something a little more mechanically sound. Not a great place to start from, but all things considered, there's still a lot of fun to be had here. Once you get familiar enough with the mechanics to start crafting strategies that work, the gameplay goes from obtuse and frustrating to intense and rewarding. But we don't have time for any of that just yet, because Seto Kaiba just showed up and he's wearing Blue Eyes White Dragon armor. Also, did I mention that we're at Stonehenge? Because, yeah, we're at Stonehenge. So what's the deal with medieval Kaiba? Well, it's the game's conceit. To complement the game's medieval England setting, various historical figures that participated in the War of the Roses have been replaced by Yu-Gi-Oh! Characters. Well, for the most part. Kaiba plays the role of Christian Rosencreuz, an esoteric scholar who may or may not have actually existed and may or may not have founded the Rosicrucian Order. From a historical perspective, Rosencreuz has little to do with the War of the Roses at all, so his presence in the game is a little suspect. But the series has always dabbled with ancient mysticism, so I'm willing to give the game a pass on his inclusion, even if it feels a little shoehorned in. Kaiba is allied to the Yorkist cause and opposes the Lancastrian druid who summoned you. At this point, players are given the choice to side with the Lancastrians, led by Henry Yugi, tutor, or Rosencreuz and the Yorkists. This will determine which of the two story routes your character will go through. Now, depending on who you ask, some players might tell you that one route is way harder than the other, but nobody seems to agree on which one. There's actually a pretty good reason for that, and it's one we need to rewind a bit to go back to. Before Kaiba comes in and crashes our Stonehenge party, our pal Simon the Druid asks us a couple of questions. The first is our name, which the player inputs. There's a total of 17 starting decks in the game, but the player is only given a couple to pick through. This is because the game runs your chosen name through a formula to select which decks are available to you at the start. In any other game, I probably wouldn't mind this. Unfortunately, it's a real problem here. The viability of the various starting decks is incredibly inconsistent. This game has some major balancing issues. The prevalence of certain terrain tiles and the deck composition of your predetermined opponents give certain monster types an advantage. Specifically, machines, zombies, and fiends all seem to fare better than the average monster type in this game. Other monster types suffer from a lack of compatible terrain. Fish and sea serpent monsters have it rough because a lot of maps just straight up lack water tiles. Sure, you can use special spell cards to change the terrain to something else, but it's not something you can always rely on. The randomized nature of the starting deck system is also the reason why nobody seems to agree on the difficulty of the two routes. A duel that seems like a cakewalk for one player might be incredibly challenging for a different player who chose a different starting deck. I really hate to put it this way, but I can't help it. The difficulty of this game really comes down to the cards you've been dealt. This is confounded by the fact that the game's progression system feels glacial compared to other card games I've played. Part of the joy of trading card games in general is getting new cards, right? It's fun to see a virtual booster pack open up and see what new cards you get to play with. Well, Duelists of the Roses doesn't seem to get that. There are two primary ways to acquire new cards in this game. The first is through a slot machine minigame that you get to play after beating an opponent. This allows you to get up to 3 cards from their deck. The second is through card reincarnation, which you can perform by clicking R3 on a card you want to get rid of in your stockpile. This process destroys the original card, but it creates 3 cards of similar value to take its place. This isn't the fastest process in the world though. You only get the chance to reincarnate a card every 5 duels, win or lose. More often than not, I wasn't really satisfied with the results either. This is my biggest problem with Duelists of the Roses. Because getting new cards is so slow and unreliable, your starting deck might not change as much as you think it would by the time the game ends. If you get stuck at any given point, it takes way too long to grind for new cards. On top of this, I never felt like I had enough cards at my disposal to experiment. It never felt like I could play around with different strategies or playstyles. I always felt limited to only using the best cards I had on hand and to form strategies with what I had access to. On top of poor card availability, the game limits the player's options in even more ways. You know how I said earlier that the game determines what cards you get from Reincarnation by the original card's value? Well, that value has a quantifiable number, and it's called deck cost. Every card in the game has a deck cost number, which is based on its power or utility. The better the card, the higher the cost. This actually ties into the story of the game in a weird way. Both the Lancastrians and the Yorkists are each in possession of 8 magical artifacts called the Rose cards, and it's the player's job to win them back for their chosen faction. To take a Rose card from another duelist, the player has to beat them in a duel using a deck with a lower total deck cost than their opponent's deck. By doing this, the game forces the player to use a selection of cards that matches their opponent's capabilities, even if the player has access to a large number of powerful cards. Because of the way these systems are designed, Duelists of the Roses ends up taking a vastly different approach to card collecting and strategy than what I'm used to. More often than not, you're left to make the best out of what you have and to find ways to succeed even when the odds are stacked against you. Although a lot of players seem to loathe the deck cost system, I actually think the game handles it pretty tastefully. There's a few duels with a considerably lower deck cost than the norm, and when tackling those, it can be fun to make a deck out of weaker monsters and spells you otherwise wouldn't have much reason to use. And then, when you get to later duels with higher deck costs, it feels like the game's finally giving you permission to go all out. It's great. That being said, I still found the game's slow and unreliable card acquisition process troublesome. I'm sure this restrictive approach to difficulty appeals to some types of people, but it's just not the sort of challenge I'm looking for out of a virtual card game. As somebody who really enjoys the deck building process, I have a lot more fun coming up with personalized decks and strategies. I don't find it as fun when I'm given a limited pool of options with only a few viable paths to victory. I will admit some of this frustration may be due to the fact I missed out on the game's New Game Plus mode, which lets you carry over your deck into the second route. To be fair, the game doesn't explain to you that there even is a New Game Plus mode, or the fact that you have to access it by hitting continue after beating the first route. As a result, I created a new game to go through the second route, and it overrode my initial save because the game lacks multiple save slots. Because of this, I missed out on a few unlockable bonuses you get for beating both routes on one save file, but nothing major. Perhaps my issues with card variety would have been addressed if I had been able to play through the second route this way, but it still wouldn't solve the problem for the initial playthrough. And chances are, a large chunk of the player base probably won't even bother with New Game Plus to begin with, especially if they're like me and don't even know it exists. When it comes to presentation, I think the game's a little hit and miss. The UI is a bit cluttered, and you can tell the localization team really had to get creative when it came to cramming English characters into these text fields. It's not the most readable game on the planet, to say the least. The game has battle cinematics, but they're... well, I'm just gonna play a few. Yeah, they're unremarkable and just kind of weird. I don't like them. Thankfully, you can turn them off in the options menu, and I recommend you do so just for the sake of speeding up the game a bit. So graphically, the game is pretty underwhelming, but the music? The soundtrack rules. This is by far my favorite part of the whole game. I don't think there's a single bad track in the whole OST. Every song complements the sequence that accompanies it, and it adds a lot of weight to the story scenes, and in many cases packs more of an emotional punch than the actual script does. This is good stuff, and even if you aren't planning on ever playing this game, I think you owe it to yourself to check out the soundtrack. But anyways, back to the story. There actually isn't a lot going on here. The player travels across a small overworld map to fight a series of duels against characters from the show. If you sided with the Lancastrians, you'll be fighting a bunch of villains to get their White Rose cards. If you sided with the Yorkists, you'll be fighting Yugi and his group of friends to get their Red Rose cards. No matter which side you align with, Kaiba will use the combined power of all 16 cards at the end of the game to summon an ancient evil entity named Manawydn Fablir. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce this. Unfortunately, he still seems pretty mad about the defeat of his brother in ancient Egypt, which is apparently a reference to the antagonist of Forbidden Memories, but I've never played it, so can't tell you much about that. He decides to take over the world for himself, and the player must seal him away by defeating him in a duel. After the final battle, you get your respective ending scene with Yugi or Kaiba. In both endings, history goes on as normal and Kaiba and his supporters mysteriously vanish, never to be heard from again. The player gets sent back to their own time and the credits roll. The ending is actually a spot where the game lets you in on a secret, though. There's actually a hidden third method of getting cards, but it's a little obfuscated. During the ending cutscene, you'll get a random password that you can enter to get a powerful card for your next playthrough. There's actually a long list of cards that you can obtain this way, but the only way to get these codes is to view the ending cutscenes and get a random one each time, or to Google a full list of them. It's a small detail, but I really appreciate the ways that they try to incorporate these passwords into the fiction. In the Lancastrian ending, it's revealed that Kaiba is actually the true author of the mysterious Voynich manuscript, which flew way over my head as a kid, but made me laugh my ass off as an adult who actually knows what that is. I love Yu-Gi-Oh! Don't get me wrong, this game might be rife with structural problems and there's some really faulty core mechanics, but there's still a lot to praise. The game's maps and enemy deck configurations are built in a way that makes each fight a unique challenge, which really kept me on my toes and planning several turns ahead at all times. In both of my playthroughs, it always felt like the enemy forces had access to slightly more powerful monsters than me. This meant I couldn't rely on brute force tactics and rushdown strategies to consistently win. I had to figure out the fusion system and make some powerful monsters, use spell cards to change the battlefield's terrain, and synergize my cards' effects to overcome my opponent. A good example of this can actually be seen in the later half of a livestream I did, which is archived on my channel. I'll link to it in the description below. I was up against Mine, a challenging duel. Early on in the round, I was able to corner her and get a decent life lead. Things were looking pretty good. She used 2 cards to power up one of her monsters and she laid it face down on the field, but I was able to perpetually spellbind it with a spell card called Paralyzing Potion, so I didn't have to worry about it. My early luck came to an end, however, when she proceeded to summon a series of other powerful monsters, all of which benefited from the mountainous terrain that made up the majority of the map. My game plan suddenly shifted. I started playing defensively and stall for time. I wanted to draw the Wasteland card I knew I had somewhere in my deck so that I could fight Mai's powerful monsters on more even footing. I also fused the card Pumpkin, King of Ghosts. When this card is in the face-up defense position, it increases the attack and defense stat of every zombie-type monster on the field by 100 points. I couldn't use it just yet, but I knew that it would be an important card to have around for staging a comeback when the opportunity presented itself. Through attribute advantages and special monster card effects, I was able to continuously spellbind Mai's monsters, buying me even more time to get the Wasteland card I so desperately needed. Even though her monsters were closing in on me, I was able to flip over Pumpkin and have him start powering up, slowly but surely. But then, things started to look bad. Really bad. In a stroke of genius, the enemy intentionally destroyed Harpy Lady Sisters, a powerful monster card that had been suffering from a multi-turn spellbind paralysis. Oh god, are they fusing? Whoa! Wait, what? Why would you do that? This decision left me dumbfounded. Was the AI really that willing to get rid of one of its most powerful cards? But the joke was on me. Soon after, Mai revealed a Monster Reborn card, allowing it to bring Harpy Lady Sisters back into play, free from paralysis. Fortunately, the discard and revival process placed the monster a bit further away than it had previously been, giving me a few extra turns to work with before I would be in some serious trouble. Although I didn't draw the Wasteland card I needed just yet, I would draw a different card that would completely change the flow of the match, Ancient Jar. When this monster is in the face-up defense position, the timer for Spellbind Paralysis never ticks down. Essentially, this means all spellbound monsters are permanently paralyzed until this card gets destroyed. I was able to spellbind Harpy Lady Sisters once more, and also get another card known as Monstrous Bird, which was also another powerful monster, spellbound as well. I activated the card, freezing both of them in place and stopping Mai's offensive momentum entirely. I continually powered up the Pumpkin card until it was powerful enough to destroy both of these monsters and win the game. However, I failed to pay attention to the Pumpkin's attribute and ended up getting it spellbound after it was used to kill Monstrous Bird. Suddenly, we were at an impasse. The most powerful monsters on both sides of the match were permanently paralyzed. Feeling confident in my life lead, I decided to cancel out the Ancient Jar's effects so that we could both move again. Unfortunately, this meant that Mai could shift her Harpy Lady Sisters into the defense position, which means I could no longer win the game by simply destroying that card. However, there was still one spellbound card on the field still in the attack position. That face-down card from all the way back at the start of the match. This is the one that Mai powered up twice before laying it down on the field, and the one that I eternally spellbound by using the Paralyzing Potion card. I knew it was probably a pretty powerful monster, so I played around with powering Pumpkin up some more, but I got impatient and I decided to go in for the attack anyways. Going into the fight, I thought I would be dealing a massive killing blow. Instead, I found my Pumpkin face to face with a beefed up monster card with a whopping 5,300 attack points. Needless to say, I lost the encounter and my Pumpkin was destroyed. It was a hard pill to swallow, but I still had a pretty big life lead and I knew the match was still in my favor. With a few spell cards, I was able to power up a reptile monster I had played onto the field and bait Mai into attacking it with one of her weaker monsters. Her attack failed, she lost the remainder of her life points, and I won the game. And goddamn did it feel good. Duelists of the Roses is at its best when matches play out like this. All the unique rules work in tandem to create a challenging and mechanically intricate match that requires the player to think on their feet to grasp victory. There's a rewarding push and pull that happens in these types of matches, and it often feels like you've just won by the skin of your teeth. It feels great. Unfortunately, not every match plays out like this. In fact, most don't, I'd say. Although the AI has an occasional stroke of genius, you'll also see that it makes a lot of really silly mistakes. For one thing, it can be too reluctant to push through the player's defenses and take risks, even when it's clearly the best option for it to take. It'll always try to wait things out even when it doesn't really make sense and let the player power up their monsters or whittle down the enemy's life points with spell cards. It's a little ridiculous past a point. The enemy will also never forfeit a match, even when it's clear that it has no hope of winning. This becomes especially noticeable when the player starts using Labyrinth terrain cards to heavily restrict the enemy's movement options. In fact, one of my most reliable strategies during my second playthrough was to get an early life lead on the opponent, restrict their ability to reach me by using a Labyrinth terrain card, and then just keep skipping turns until the timer ran out and I won by time over. Any human player would have thrown in the towel after it became apparent what was going on, but the computer never will. And so you just have to keep manually skipping turns until the timer runs dry, and it's a little obnoxious. Other than that, the inherent randomness involved with card games can sometimes lead to awkward situations. Notably, if the player gets a really good starting hand and the enemy gets a really bad starting hand, it's entirely possible for the player to corner the enemy and end the match before the AI even gets a chance to do much. Likewise, the AI can do the same to you if you get a bad starting hand. In fact, this is how I beat the final boss on my first route. While it's a little funny at first to win this way, I can't say it feels particularly rewarding in the long run. I would have liked to see some safeguards in place to prevent this sort of thing from happening. Maybe restrict the deck leader's movements for the first few turns before they can fully move across the entire map, I don't know. Just something to make sure that one player can't corner the other and just automatically win in like 5 turns or something. It's a little dumb. For every single point of praise I can possibly give this game, there's also at least one glaring flaw that counters it, and that drives me up the wall. The music is phenomenal, but the game itself is ugly as sin. The game can present some challenging yet rewarding scenarios, but sometimes matches just boil down to dumb luck. There's a lot of potential for strategy with the card system, but the game never gives you enough cards to play around with and experiment. The historical setting is cute, but the story is bare bones and pretty generic. I like this game a lot, but it really tests my patience. Duelists of the Roses feels like a big bag of dominoes. Sometimes, everything aligns perfectly and the results are spectacular. But far too often, things get messy or fall apart in ways that don't exactly feel rewarding. That being said, I'd be lying if I said I didn't have a soft spot for this game. If you grew up with Yu-Gi-Oh! Or are just a fan of weird card games in general, I genuinely believe this game is worth your time and attention. For a game that went on to be a best-selling title in the PS2 library, I still find Duelists of the Roses a rather bizarre and unique experience overall. I don't think I can say I've ever played anything quite like it, and I would have loved to see a sequel with a bit more polish. Hell, I don't even want an official follow-up or anything, I just want a successor to this game in some form. It would be cool to see an indie development team try to take this game's gameplay system and make something that's a little more mechanically sound. This game's rule set is just way too interesting and full of potential to never be touched on again, but it really looks like this game never received a proper follow-up, and that makes me sad. But until that oddly specific hole in my heart can be filled, I'll be taking a look at other card and tabletop-based games whenever I come across one that seems interesting enough for me to review for this series. Oh, and if you want to watch that archive of the stream I did that I talked about in this video, I've linked to that down below in the description. And while I'm promoting my own shit, consider supporting me on Patreon if you like the stuff I make and want to help me on my journey to make even more. Other than that, I got nothing else. See you next time, hope you have a good night.